You know those old-fashioned balancing scales where on the one hand you might put the weight and on the other hand the thing you're weighing, and the idea is to get things in balance. My experience of life is that often we find ourselves a little bit like one of those old-fashioned scales. One of the challenges of life often is to get things in balance. And that might be because we live very pressured lives with lots of competing demands on us. I can certainly identify with that. And it is a case of getting a balance between the different demands, and maybe even we might call our work-life balance also, getting that sense of wholeness and well-being from a sense of balance. Even if our lives are less busy, there will be different things we can put our attentions and energies into, and we know that a wise way to live is to keep things in balance. Within a family or a community with lots of different relationships going on, we know how it is to try and work towards having that sense of balance in all things. As we listen to the Gospel reading for today, it's clear to me that Jesus is offering us a vision of a very particular kind of balance. He's doing it in the context of conflict and opponents, the Pharisees, who are trying to unbalance Jesus with tricky questions. We've had a question about tax, and we've had a question about death, or more accurately, resurrection, those two certainties of life, tax and death. But now we have a challenge from what one might describe as a good scribe, a little bit like the Good Samaritan. Scribes are often the enemies of Jesus, but here is a scribe who seems to be on Jesus' side and is affirming Jesus' sense of balance. So let's listen. It's from Mark chapter 12, I should say, starting at verse 28. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that Jesus answered them well, he asked him, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength.' The second is this, 'You shall love your neighbour as yourself.' There is no other commandment greater than these." Then the scribe said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and beside him there is no other. And to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbour as oneself, this is much more important than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." After that, no one dared to ask him any question. That essential balance that Jesus marks out between love of God on the one hand and love of neighbour on the other. Actually, a balance that I think you can trace right back into the Old Testament, and even to Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with his 2 tablets of stone. And whilst the scriptural record doesn't say this precisely, one could well see one of those tablets having the first 4 commandments, which are all centred on the way in which we express as a community of faith our love of God. Love only God. Do not make idols. Do not take the Lord God's name in vain, and honour the Sabbath. And then on the other tablet, maybe the 6 other commandments, which are all about our human relationships and the structuring of good and safe and wholesome society. Love God and love your neighbour, held in balance. Reflecting on those experiences from our own lives of balance, it does seem to me that that sense of balance can come in different ways. And the first image I would offer you is, and maybe you've done this, where you've been to the shops and you are carrying the shopping home. Let's say that you're doing it the environmental way. And what's the obvious and wise thing to do? Not to put everything in one bag, but to share the load between two. And so you carry the weight, one on each arm. And it does make it that little bit easier. But it is a burdensome sense of balance, being pulled down in two directions at once. A second image of balance might be of a tightrope walker. Not that I've ever tried it, but we can watch and admire the skill of a tightrope walker, not carrying any great weight at all, but that absolute requirement to keep a balance to neither go to the left nor to the right, because of course a big fall awaits if one goes either way, but that sense of sticking to a very narrow line. But I think there is a third way of thinking about balance. Two ways to describe it, but I think they're the same. And the first is to think of a bird with two wings. Two wings which, in balance, help the bird to fly and to soar into the sky. Not a being weighed down, not a neither one way or the other, but a lifting, a raising. And another way to think about that sense of balance maybe is to think of two singers or two musicians in duet, following different lines, playing different music, but absolutely in balance, and adding to the richness of the music for doing so. Again, that sense of soaring. As we think of Jesus, drawing on that Old Testament tradition of commandment, and talking about holding the two in balance, I think of that third kind of balance, not a weighing down, not being weighed on the one hand with an obligation to God and on the other hand an obligation to one another. Neither a delicate tightrope walk where one wants to go neither one way nor the other, but that sense of the two working together to lift us, to help us fly as human beings and of course as disciples of Jesus. This weekend, of course, is a weekend when, in many traditions, we'll be celebrating All Saints' Day, maybe less so in our tradition, but nonetheless, that sense of our deep gratitude and connectedness with all those generations of faithful people who have gone before. We might think of those who inspired our own faith and who have drawn us to Christ or have shown us Christ in their living an example. And I would suggest that actually where we do reflect on those treasured memories and the sense of continuing story that we carry, those people who have inspired us have been precisely the people who have been able to mirror something of that sense of balance to which Jesus points. That their sense of godliness is actually profoundly humane and affirming of human relationships. And their human relationships have opened up windows onto godliness and a sense of God's presence in our midst. May we know that sense of balance, love of God and love of neighbour in our own lives.